next speaker today is Mr. Kevin Tomlin, who will be talking about Black musicians in the influence of Black musicians on the music industry. And at the same time, I'll be handing over to my co-host, Eve Anderson. Thank you so much. Over to Kevin Tomlin.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
can everybody hear me?
Continue.
Yes, we can hear you, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Good. Right. I'm going to do a summary to do with what influence have Black musicians had on the music industry. You're talking about at least between 70 to 80 years. So I need to do it in such a way that I talk about benchmark achievements. A lot of the things I'll be talking about is behind the scene information that is not available to the public generally. But let's say one thing that is key, that hip hop music is the biggest selling genre right now in the world. Actually, it's actually surpassed rock music, country, and it is the most significant movement in terms of music. It's probably generating maybe about 6 to 7 billion worldwide. But let's go back to the beginning. The first successful music company, Black music company in the world, was a company that was based in Chicago called VJ Records. It was jointly owned by Vivian Carter and James Braxton. Interestingly enough, it was the first label in the US that had a contract with the Beatles, would you believe it? That's quite interesting. And they managed to have one #1 single on the charts called Love Me Do. And those of you who are of my generation, I was born during the 50s, might remember those tracks. And that made $1 million. Also, it was the first company to have another successful, in terms of a Black company, to have a successful seasons. If anybody remember during the 70s, Oh What a Night, that is one of their hits. But so you can give you an idea who they are. During the time at VJ Records, they had 3 consecutive #1 Hot 100 singles to the charts. The first one was Oh Cherry Baby, Cherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, that's the next one, and Walk Like a Man. All those 3 singles that I mentioned went #1. And they went #1 for, all 3 singles went #1 for about 13 weeks. And the Hot 100 Billboard charts. The Hot 100 Billboard charts, of course, is the chart that represent pop singles, just like the British official pop singles chart, right? Now, after that, unfortunately, VJ Records went into bankruptcy after 10 years, but by the time it actually, of its demise, it sold about $15 million in total earning, right? And also, which is interesting about it, if you look at today's equivalents, today's money, that's probably about maybe $100 million in today's currency, or even more. It depends, you're dealing with inflation, of course, right? Now, let's move on quickly. Let's talk about Motown. This is where it gets rather interesting. When I talk about Motown, there's going to be a lot of firsts in history, in music history, be a lot of firsts. Motown music had a studio band called the Funk Brothers. They are probably the most successful studio bands globally in terms of amount of singles that went to #1. All right. First significant thing about Motown is that a little youngster by the name of Stevie Wonder was the first recording artist in history to have a live single and a live album at #1 simultaneously in music history. That was in 1963. Also, Supremes still holds the record, according to Guinness Book of Record, as the only female vocal group in history to have 12 #1s on the Hot 100 singles chart. 12. They still hold that record, and nobody has actually beaten it. They also was the first group, female vocal group in history, to have 3 singles from their studio album at #1. The album was Where Did Our Love Go? Right, and out of that, they had Where Did Your Love Go, Baby Love, and Come See About Me. All those 3 singles were #1 on the Hot 100 charts. And as I said today, that at this moment, they are still the only group in history with 12 #1 singles to still hold that record. They were the first as well, first group, female group in history to actually close off a decade with a single at top of the #1 position, where it was called Someday We Will Be Together. Right, also, another interesting thing as well, that the late Bobby Womack was the first artist to actually create a #1 single for the Rolling Stones. It's All Over Now. In 1964, the Rolling Stones' first single, #1 single on the British official pop single chart, was co-written by the late Bobby Womack and his cousin's wife, Shirley Womack. All right, and that was a million seller, of course. Right, then we got some more interesting things. In 1967, Aretha Franklin came on the scene with a smash, selling 3.5 million copies with singles and album. That very same year, as Motown began to sell more records and other black recording artists begin to take center stage and soul is begin to emerge as a musical form, the American music industry hit the $1 billion mark in 1967, the same year that Aretha Franklin exploded in the scene as the biggest selling female recording artist at the time during that year, with 3.5 million copies worth of singles and album in the US when she was contracted to Atlantic Records. By the end of the 1960s, Motown by then had sold maybe something like 100 million in gross earning, or probably more, because on average it was doing about something like 30 to 40 million per year. Just to give you an idea, Motown was, you could say, was just as big as some of the major record labels of the time. That's how significant the amount of units the label was actually moving during that time. When we go into the 70s now, this gets very interesting. As I said, I'm doing a summary because there's so much we could talk about black musicians that could go on forever. But when you go on my website, Signature Sounds Online, you will find out more information about that. One of the biggest selling soundtracks during the 70s was Superfly by Curtis Mayfield. Superfly, which was on Curtis Mayfield's label, which he was jointly owned, called Curtain Records, out of Chicago, sold over $26 million for the industry in 1972. It was #1 for 4 weeks on the pop album charts in the US. It's called 200 Billboard Pop Album Charts. If we look at it in terms of 26 million, probably look at it in currency today, it probably be maybe about 150 million US dollars or even more. Depends on the rate of exchange and inflation. Another significant label, and of course, remember, Motown was still operating during that time as well. So now you begin to have about, by the 1970s, you had about 5 or 6 black record companies operating in the US from the West Coast to the East Coast, right? One of the interesting companies that set up a contract with CBS Record at the time in 1971 was called Philadelphia International Record, which the OJs, Billy Paul, 3 Degrees, and so on came out of that label. In the first 9 months of business, after it signed its contract with CBS Records, which at the time was led by Clive Davis, who signed, of course, Whitney Houston to a contract years later when he established Arista Records. First 9 months of business, Philadelphia International did 9 million copies worth of singles and 2 million copies worth of albums in the first 9 months of business. Just to give you the idea, the level of sales and impact it was having both in the US and globally. With that, it would be equated to probably about $10 to $15 million or more in gross earning the first year. On average, during its peak, Philadelphia International would do about between 30 to 40 million US dollars. And don't forget also, Motown is doing that amount or probably more. So you have 2 to 3 or 4 black music labels doing that kind of volume in the market space, right? Right at the same time that was actually happening, you had a company called Sussex Record on the West Coast, which had discovered Bill Withers, who was generating millions of sales as well in the US. And significantly, when we go to Detroit in particular, where you had Motown, Hot Wax, and Invictus Records, they were generating between 60 to 70 million combined from the Detroit area. By the end of the 1970s, music of Black origin generated over $500 million in gross earning. When I say music of Black origin, you have jazz funk, you have traditional gospel, you had soul, disco, and so forth, all black generated, and included, of course, white artists was using black music as well, or recording black music. $500 million. And if we equate that in currency today, that would be the size of the UK music market, which is £5.2 billion, right? Just to give you an idea of the level of volume, $500 million, which is close to about 700 million US dollars, for a music industry that was approximately doing about 5 to 6 billion. So to give you a sort of idea, the level of sales that black music was actually doing during that time. During that, which is significant as well, that the late Teddy Pendergrass during that time was one of the few, I think he's one of the first male artists and also black artists as well to have 5 consecutive multi-platinum albums. That means albums that sold over 2 million copies each, which in itself is the first time in history during that time that was achieved. And Teddy Pendergrass was on a black label, Philadelphia International Records. During 1979 was significant because that's the first time that a black artist, Michael Jackson, with his Off the Wall album, created a 8 million copies sell. 8 million copies that he sold the first time around with Off the Wall. And what's significant about this album also is that both the white division and the black division of CBS Records came together to promote the album, to break down the racial barrier and give it a total exposure. And it achieved phenomenal. Even today, Off the Wall is still selling. I think it's close to about 12 million copies now and rising, right? Also with CBS Black Record Division, it generated on average during that period, right into the late 80s, about $100 million in gross earning, the Black Music Division of CBS, right? Also, by the time the 80s started kicking, you had another interesting black label by the name of Solar Records. It says The Sound of Los Angeles. Solar Records owned by Dick Griffin, which came out of the Soul Train experience and emerged into a label called Solar Records in Los Angeles. Solar Records, in its first, in 1980, generated over 40 million in gross earning. This was due to Shalimar, second time around, and The Beats Goes On by Whispers. Those albums were huge sales. So that was another, that label that was operating at the same time as Philly International. So by then, we had about 6 or 7 labels. Remember, don't forget, you got Curtain label, which is by Curtis Mayfield. So all these labels creating a large volume of sale across the board. And then don't forget, you got Crest Records, founded by Quincy Jones, that was generating millions as well, with George Benson, Give Me the Night, which was the first project, a platinum project. And then afterwards we go, as the decades progress, this is where it gets interesting. By the mid-1986, after the dust was settled with Thriller, which by then had sold about something like, okay, let's address the Thriller project. For an entire year, Thriller was selling 1 million copies per month in the US alone. I repeat, it was selling 1 million copies per month in the US alone, right? And also, what is interesting is that Thriller actually set a new history because it was the first time that an album was marketed or released simultaneously in every major music market across the globe. So regardless of the time scale and logistics and everything, the album was released the same time in America, in the UK, in France, every major market. And it's today, Thriller has sold something like 100 million copies globally and still selling. By the mid-80s as well, as I was saying, that the black music artists and production songwriters, production teams and producers and arrangers was doing 30% of the business in the US. That's something, I would say something about 30%. It would be equated into about between $3 to $4 billion in business out of a $5 to $6 billion business. So in actual fact, black artists were generating larger volumes than actually white artists. For instance, Whitney Houston's first album sold 14 million in the US. Janet Jackson's Control album did between 6 to 8 million. Lionel Richie, Can't Slow Down, one of his major Motown albums, did actually 10 million copies. You know, phew. Then you got Prince with Purple Rain, which did something like 16, 17 million copies in the US. So just to give you an idea, the level of sales that was going on with just black artists, with Sade, with late Luther Vandross, and so forth, Whitney Houston, it was absolutely a runaway impact. Right. So let's just jump into the 90s quickly. In the 90s, around about, say, 1994 in particular, Def Jam Records was doing 34 million. The Face record was doing 37 million. Perspective Records was doing 10 million. And Bad Boy Production, which to do with P. Diddy, was doing 20 million. And then you got Uptone Records, you got MCA, Black Division was doing 100 million. So just to give you more idea what's actually going on. Right. By the time 1994 came around, the music industry was doing $10 billion by then, and with black music doing 2.4 billion in business. That's the estimate, 2.4 billion, right? By the end of the 90s, with the impact of Tony Braxton, Usher, Mary J. Blige, and so forth, the music industry globally was doing $40 billion. That's to give you an idea the level of impact with the UK and in the US. Now, at the present time, the world market for music is roughly about $20 billion now, with the UK doing about 5.2 billion pounds in gross earning, with 2 billion of that is going toward export. There's a lot of black creative power brokers in the UK that has been responsible for many of the major hits that has come out of the UK, black creative power brokers in terms of Lawrence Johnson, Nicky Brown, Luke Smith, and so forth. All these people have worked on major albums that have generated hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and pounds. If I put Nicky Brown and Lawrence Johnson together, I would say they actually donate about 200 to 300 million pounds in gross their contribution to the industry over the years. It's hard for me to actually summarize this, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the level of commercial impact of people of black origin. Matter of fact, the best selling and the most successful record producers in history is Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. They have the most #1 singles in history, and they are the longest serving music songwriting publishers in history.
Kevin, you have about a minute to go.
That's all right, darling.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Right. So I'm just summarizing by saying that at the present time, the last thing I want to mention is that the Thriller video sold 48 million in the US. So this is the level of achievement. And any other information that is needed, people can get it from my website, Signature Sounds Online, which I have. And that's it. Thank you. This work is by Kevin Tomlin, who is a music historian, artist and art teacher.